Hello everyone, today we talk about the Condottieri and in a very different video from the usual because up to now I think I've never discussed about the Condottieri themselves. I think I hinted sometimes at the rise of mercenaries into the Italian peninsula at one point, but never quite got getting into the military nature of it, and neither today we will do it, unfortunately. Really choose the topics of my videos randomly, so this is how I operate. It's like finding order from chaos, and sometimes I don't do things in order. So I haven't made an introduction in the Condottieri. I haven't essentially discussed about um, their warfare in itself, which is very interesting indeed, and it's also often not really overlooked because it's one of the few topics that more or less everybody has heard when learning and studying the Middle Ages, also all over the world, we can say. But also in here there are so many still misconceptions, some of which we bring. I mean, some things, some prejudices, some stereotypes about the Condottieri are true, and today we will look at a part of that. But also there are so many kind of even misunderstood more than actually misconceived elements of this story that we bring back since the Renaissance. As a matter of fact, most of the prejudices we have, for instance, the greatest one is that the Condottieri warfare was essentially bloodless. That these guys basically didn't kill each other because they thought it was inconvenient. They saw war as a business. Well, actually, war has always been a business at all times in history, so that's not really the point. Objectively, there were certain reasons that naturally brought this Condottieri to preserve a little bit something, but from historical evidence we see that otherwise, actually, Condottieri warfare was as bloody as any other one, and it's not that. But this is not, unfortunately, the topic of today's videos. And these are things were put out there essentially by Machiavelli at the time, who was one of the greatest minds, arguably some kind of the founder of the modern literature, modern political theory, also in many ways, but that was also very ideological oriented, and even as a historian, he tended to bend really reality as his own consume. And please read Machiavelli because it's extremely interesting and mind-opening on that world, but always keep in mind that he had an agenda and he essentially was writing because of this, and he wasn't quite of a also from a military point of view, he wasn't much of an expert. He was just a functionary and an ambassador, essentially. He was more a man of bureau, of politics, of certain things. He wasn't properly a soldier, definitely. So we have always to use caution when approaching these topics. But today I would like to look at something else, a bit thought provoking, but really, I will try to deliver it in a very kind of explanatory way, and not really in a documentary way, not really in a making an ideological point, but it's the idea that the pretty self-evident realization actually that the Condottieri as such produced freaking lot of indirectly actually freaking lot of works of art for many reasons. As you know, the Condottieri, now we're talking about essentially this phase of late medieval Italy that at this point was essentially ruled by mostly kind of princely or kind of mercantile states. Were sometimes the same thing, and they were extremely wealthy, extremely advanced in many fields of knowledge of civilization. Just recently I made a video about that has nothing to do with military history. It's actually history of art, more or less. That was on the where was it? Florentine Renaissance in visual art, etc. And that this was something partly related also to today's topic, but very, very far. And I must confess, I'm not a great fan of the period. I mean, obviously, I like very much this phase of history, but it's not that I got ever thoroughly interested in it, chiefly because it's something that it's a topic, it's a phase that kind of many people get interested in. For this very reason, I tend instead to shift towards relatively less known periods. For instance, I like very much. Today we're talking essentially the 15th century. I like much more the 14th century, the 13th century. I think they are much more interesting by certain standards. But also this phase is definitely so interesting to explore. And this is also a chance for me to learn something more about that. And the thought-provoking idea, as I said, is that war, at this point, the glory of the Condottieri was producing art. So we are in the Renaissance. These princely states sometimes were ruled even by Condottieri themselves. This is a tradition that started kind of late in time. At the dawn of Schwerpunkt, I made a video, in fact, that is called Gianfrancesco Gonzaga and the Military Tradition of the Mantuan Marquisate. That is a so-so video because it was like one of my very first ones, but that it's what it frames the period. I mean, the moment in which basically these Italian lords, so those who controlled essentially the city-state, the regional state at that point, basically began themselves as individuals to make a living as condottieri. Now this is also very, I should kind of explain this better because it's not, I mean, the very first lords, and I made some videos now about the rise of lordship in communal Italy, were de facto not condottieri, but they were fighters. There were people who spent their life on horseback. Just think about the Della Scala, the Visconti, etc. These were people who had risen literally through the ranks sometime. I mean, not really through the ranks because they didn't came from the, they didn't make a fortune through the military, like instead, for instance, the Sforza would do in the 15th. But it was normal at the time to be at the head of a political faction and to be a fighter, a warrior, essentially. So they had mastered the craft of arms pretty well at the time, but they weren't condottieri proper. The condottieri were essentially the name starts. It derives from the condotta, which was a contract. It was like the English indenture, for instance. It was the same thing. It was a contract of hiring mercenaries that eventually, in 15th century Italy, but found this greater expansion and basically this greater structuration, this greater development that brought at a certain point not just free companies of mercenaries to be hired by these powers, but of transforming, we can say, the same local state into a condotta. This is poorly said. It's obviously nothing like this ever happened. But in the case of the Gonzaga, for instance, that we were saying before, you see that these were lords of Mantua, but they were essentially selling their services to either Venice or Milan and so on. So it's as if these leaders were essentially in the first line when it took to be condottieri. So not just they hired condottieri on their own, and they maintained them together with their own retinues and this kind of nuclei of kind of in the very small nuclei of kind of permanent armies that were developing in those times, but they also were hired in turn by other powers as condottieri. Also today we will see, for instance, the Montefeltro in Urbino. This is something that's very similar, and this was generally the trend now. I mean, even great, it's as if today the president of a, obviously it's a wild approximation, but it's as if the president of a small European country now hired his services to a bigger country like, I don't know, France or Germany to fight some proxy wars somewhere and sharing benefits and getting favors for his own state, and that's essentially it. And So this is a very important frame to explain about today's topic, because it makes you understand that basically world society revolved around this military system in some measure. Naturally, the other states were nothing like that. There were states that kind of even despised and were extremely cautious. Even the hiring of mercenaries, take Florence, that traditionally didn't want to spend money. It was a kind of a very florid mercantile republic and was nothing like about war. Milan was something radically different. It was kind of a more military state, but also was definitely something more centralized, something more bureaucratic as well. So there are also these differences that naturally you have to take into account and understand why certain lords did become condottieri, others didn't. Certain lordships were even created by other states after for certain condottieri that had served in their sense as soldiers, and in that sense had really risen from the ranks and were settled somewhere into a fief that belonged. This was done often by Venice, for instance, that bordered with Milan, because they wanted to create this kind of a buffer, not buffer states, because these were fiefdoms of Venice, but like framing certain certain military men and their retinues in there. And this would, by the way, also in the case of Venice especially, it triggered also the development of a very efficient military system, because eventually the settling down equated to the fact that the condottieri maintained his own retinue. And when he died, these troops were known as lanze spezzate, that is broken lances, because they were, now there are different etymologies in here, that could be broken in the sense as military units because they were under strength and were incorporated into other armies, or because they were broken because their commander was dead, so they basically didn't have an employer. So these were incorporated eventually into the Venetian army. It was at the time, together with the French army and the Burgundian one, that actually was inspired by France and Venice, the most advanced military system in Europe. So it's evident that in those cases where the Condottieri started a dynasty and they started ruling on their own, and this could go very, very back in time, because there were lords, and in fact, like the Montefeltro were quite of an old family of that had crafted this business from quite of an ancient times, because these were families of feudal and read military origin in this sense. For since a very long time, the Montefeltro, I remember up to the 13th century, even before. Then there were this very ancient. Think about the Este as well. So it would be interesting to go eventually in detail to every one of these. But the point I'm making today, I guess, is that this was producing a lot of wealth, because war, as we've seen, was a business. The Italian lords were quite powerful, they were quite rich, and they could spend not just for war, but also for art. I mean, great part of the Renaissance, actually, and its artistic production weren't produced just by, were produced definitely by these amazing, artists that were present in Italy at that time, because, in history we've always had somewhere, at all times, a Michelangelo or a Leonardo, but the point is that you also have to have a context where to develop this talent. So and that was a time in space in history where definitely these geniuses could express their own, and they could express it because they were paid, they were financed, they were supported economically, and their works of art were commissioned by sometimes lords, including condottieri. So the condottieri naturally wanted to essentially express the most of the times the glory of his own family, showing, look at how powerful and we are, and so on. Having a work of art like a private chapel, an equestrian statue, a residence or a portrait or something like it that we all see today, was a reason of a motive of great glory. It was a brilliant political propaganda to show the might of this family. So consider also that great part of this Renaissance came into Italy. Not much. Italy didn't have a monarchy on its own. Just in the south there was this first Angevin, then Aragonese. Actually, vice kingdom, especially with under Spanish, that were a vice kingdom. But it was a kind of a kingdom on its own. Theoretically, the north was a kingdom in itself, framed into the Holy Roman Empire. But these guys were now essentially all separated, split, and it is largely mercantile republics that, by a certain degree, all the Italian lordships were, aside certain ones that had a more markedly feudal character, including great part of this one, the Condottieri usually, were essentially, in fact, not, there were certain dynasties. I mean, you take the Medici, for instance, even in Florence, etc. But Florence is the best example in this sense, because there were so many other families that existed within the city, that each one with their own palace, with their own thing, they all participated to the old communal magistracies that sometimes were still in place. I mean, most of the times, actually. And therefore there was a kind of an inner competition between these families. So every family on longer range, every lordship wanted to show off, to say, look how powerful and wealthy I am, and therefore building all of these things that equated naturally also to have a clientele, because when you see all of these great works of art historically, and not just in the Renaissance, you have to think there was someone who was working, who was fed by these working places, by these by the work that was entailed to build this thing. So these families were expanding their clienteles by attracting people into these working sites and essentially making them depend on them. And this also brought naturally to the patronage of the arts as such. So even having the best artists, the best scientists, the best engineers, architect, and people, usually the great names of this time were all of these things together, were polymaths usually. It was a moment, a reason of great pride, because naturally that genius could do things that others didn't. And this triggered, in fact, Renaissance as we know it. The great Italian banking power was used to found this works, this initiative, so, and that's how you basically have the Renaissance. So it wasn't for the sake of, there are many people out there that, I'm making this video also for some ideological reason, because people like sometimes to oppose this very stupid political idea of opposing art and civilization to war as a kind of an anti-human and brutal and destructive force. But actually, this is not true. Human societies really work like this, and this is a brilliant example we're talking about today, about art that is essentially fueled by war. So read by slaughters, massacres, plots, bloodshed of some sort. So this also opens naturally a moral problem, because how should we see society in the past? We should try to understand it for what it was, not pretending certain ideological reads of history that are also quite inaccurate, just for making us feeling better, or what. This was what reality was. The things like the Sistine Chapel, or they were built, for instance, with papal tithes, for instance, and collected all over Europe on the back of peasants who were struggling to survive. And does this make the Sistine Chapel less beautiful than what it is? Obviously not. But this is the point, I guess. I mean, this is a bit the human nature in itself. This is a coexistence of good and evil that objectively is very difficult to resolve, and that it's just what we are. Studies show us that the advancement of civilization But I would say not studies, but history in itself proves that the advancements of civilization doesn't go with a lowering of of violence. Sadly enough, of aggressiveness, of conflict. In a nutshell, there are certain, let's say, dynamics that bring to less, more or less brutal times in history. For instance, currently we live, in spite of all the wars that are being fought out there, one of the most peaceful times in history, quite easily, without even needing to discuss why, because it's self-evident. Part of this is related also, for instance, to the rise of nuclear weapons. That since World War II kind of froze most of open conflict, and albeit exposing us to the risk of a nuclear holocaust, we at least we stopped fighting in this mass wars like the two world wars. So, but this is a digression. Just to make you understand that objectively, what we see is always the kind of the shell, the of something else, the tip of the eye, especially in history, and especially in a history that left us relatively a few. I mean, what we can't see today of history, that we always have only a small part, and the Renaissance was actually. I talked sometimes about the Renaissance now in kind of not very flattering terms, because many people are fascinated with the Renaissance, but as a medievalist, of course, I'm a bit biased. I see the other part of the story, and I'm not really saying that the Renaissance was a better or worse period than others, but always bear in mind that even this greatness that we see is the epiphenomenon of certain dynamics that were actually the result of a crystallization of society, of a stratification of society, actually, and we see basically this concentration, even in patronage and so on, the product of a very kind of verticized society that was able to concentrate all of this huge wealth at the top, because it was getting kind of a princely nature, and therefore could also afford to pay for literates, of course, etc. But if society had been in another fashion, maybe we would have not had even all these beautiful Renaissance masterpieces, but maybe people at the time would have been better, with a more equally owned wealth, but history took other paths, and we have to take it for what it is, essentially, not to to idealize, and always remaining conscious about the fact that history could have really taken radically other paths, at a very sometimes with very slight changes of what history had been. Maybe I drink a little bit before we finally go on, but yeah, this is what I wanted to advise you a bit. It was also a bit critical. Is Renaissance and humanism, personal considerations. This is what I made, and I think it was the first time I was talking about the Middle Age, the Renaissance, and I debate a little bit about it. It's perhaps not a great video, also because in 36 minutes, I think, if I remember correctly what I said, it's just really too thought-provoking, and it doesn't add a lot of substance, but it's just a thought, a perspective to consider the Renaissance, maybe not differently, but under a different perspective from the way it's usually done. So I drink, and we try to go on now. So, talking about the Condottieri, we could, and I definitely will discuss at one point what, really the longing, the craving for glory was in this world. How much the Renaissance also rediscovering the classical knowledge was kind of exalting certain ethical values that had been kind of always remained out there, but had not, even during medieval times, but had not been quite recovered in their full classical meaning. Like, the idea of glory in the classical sense is obviously something very different from the Christian one. So at this point, Renaissance was also recovering in part this kind of pagan-like and classical legacy in terms of the military ethics. And it was a big deal of emulation that this Condottieri wanted to make of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, which is evident. I think we're all acquainted to this phenomenon, and this was naturally very evident in art, and also in this sense the the artistical representation. I hate spring. The artistical representations were kind of keeping these models for the celebration of the Condottieri themselves. And as we said, the Condottieri often, at least the most successful ones, made a freaking lot of money. So this money was vital actually to keep on their own system, so to finance their own retinues, their own units. But also a very great part of this, a relatively consistent part of this, and this makes you understand how much political propaganda is important, as much is a weapon, as much as a condotta unit, to finance the celebration of their own personas and of their own endeavors, their own deeds. And the relation here was definitely complicated. We said at the beginning of the video what kind of essentially of diversity existed also within this Italian word, between the relation between the state, you can call it in this way at this point, and the military commanders that at this point were by standard condottieri. We mentioned before that basically the condotta at this point had also actually as in many other countries at this point with the military companies, it worked essentially like that. But basically, if you wanted, there weren't really permanent armies at this point, or at least they were just being created, but these were normally households. This doesn't mean there were a few. Also, France was developing something. France was kind of on the lead in this kind of the creation of permanent armies proper, because that was what in Europe resembled the most to a state, or it was objectively already one. But for the rest, the military of the European powers at this point was entirely made up by these mercenaries. I mean, surely there were still the old levies, either the ban or the feudal levies, but mostly it was about mercenaries, and mercenaries sometimes were in fact also the same noblemen that made a living out of it. So it was a kind of a transformation. I discussed sometimes this on if you go into medieval warfare playlist, there is some hint at this passage between chiefly the 13th and 14th century, from the very approximately, of course, from the kind of the feudal organization of the armies to essentially the company ones that would remain as the base, basically, of the European armies until essentially the second half of the late modern age, practically, when states instead started actually centralizing, having a permanent army on their own. But essentially up to the end of to the 30 years war, that of course were kind of national armies, but at the same time most of the, especially in that war, most of the troops were still mercenary in nature. Then of course, France, Sweden, and Spain at the origin had their own kind of military, but it was kind of permanent. But also in there, the way it was organized sometimes was also very much tied to this even kind of private enterprises, because basically also the permanent armies were sometimes commissioned to the same noblemen that had their private retinues still. So also the process of the centralization of state was still kind of struggling to be formed. It's basically not before Louis XIV in France that this full, you know, statal army basically is kind of formed as a functional thing. But and then other European powers naturally followed in this pattern of organization. But aside from this, what I was saying is that the relation between the Condottieri and the state was sometimes very complicated, simply because the power of the state basically relied on the behavior of these commanders, on who they could switch their allegiance to, who paid them better, essentially. And but sometimes the problems were also more complex in the sense that, within the same internal politics, because as we've said also in here, states were kind of composite still in nature. There were several different interests, several different factions. So this Condottieri had a political weight, not indifferent political weight within the states, and they used the Condottieri used their political and military power to insist in front of the states, essentially two of which they were clients practically, to in order to render the celebration of their own personas official. So in a way, if you wanted to look at it in another fashion, basically we're pushing for part of their salaries of their for which they were employed through the condotta was essentially devolved to the public celebration of their own personas. This is very important because it basically entailed that the condottieri became part, in a certain sense, of the identity of the same state. And let's give a look to some examples of this, of certain artists that basically were mobilized and engaged in this kind of this, I don't even know how to call it, in this into this restlessness for glory, this thirst of glory that the Condottieri were pushing for. So looking at these artists and some of their works, and give me a second because I put here the first, when I have to insert the picture in the video. Starting with so what, here we are, 33. Let's start with whom? With Paolo Uccello. Yeah, why not? So this is a beautiful. This is essentially the equestrian monument dedicated to John Oakwood by Paolo Uccello in 1436. So this is a work. You see how it's very beautiful. This is located essentially in the internal left wall of the Florence Cathedral. So this is also very important because it goes together with what we'll see also in a while, that is the equestrian monument to Niccolò da Tolentino, made by Andrea del Castagno in the same location, and the work is beautiful. So, and this is going to be a video essentially about the history of art in part. So there is a bit of extra comment, but that's essentially what we're looking at. So you know that John Oakwood was probably one of the greatest soldiers of fortune. That it was a condottiere, definitely, and medieval English knight. He was a lord in Italy of several cities and so on, and he had this extremely fascinating history we can't now go in depth with, but The important is that he had very strange relations with Florence, that at a certain time hired him, then he fought against Florence on the point, then he was rehired. So eventually, when he died in 1394, the Florentines basically buried him with great honors into their own cathedral, and their rests eventually would be essentially taken away from there by John Oakwood's son, because King Richard II of England actually asked for this. So in his memory, in memory of John Oakwood, Florence eventually commissioned this portrait, a equestrian portrait, made by Paolo Uccello, where the Condottieri had been buried originally. So you immediately realize first of all, the equestrian portraits of these commanders were quite the standard, because they had started being since an early time. Actually, already in 14th century file, certain beautiful funerary monuments that are depicting with with sometimes even the same statues over the tomb, practically. Obviously, smaller scale, but this fresco is amazing, actually, and this work was basically carried out in 3 months only, and initially it was also modified, because initially the people who had created this didn't like it, practically, and there is a problem also realizing how these original plans of painting of drawings really were. There's all a field of research. It's still pretty active, probably, and could surely give certain good satisfaction to a lucky historian. And this fresco was also restored at a point by another artist in during the 16th century, etc. This painting was, this fresco was realized, as you understand, in, as I said before, in 1436. So that was the date. And when you look at it, the first thing comes into your mind is these equestrian statues that you can see in Rome, for instance, chiefly the statue of Marcus Aurelius that is still existing, and there's a copy outside on the at the Palazzo dei Conservatori, but there is also the statue is preserved, I think, within the museum of the Capitolium, and the original one. And it's one of the few statues that survived from classical times, because at the point it was believed to have been Marcus Aurelius was exchanged for Constantine, practically. So the statue was not demolished by the Christians at that point, because that was unfortunately the practice at that point. And this at the time was a statue that was being studied, naturally, and admired, and whose model was the model which was being re-proposed for these works of art now. And at this point, the equestrian monuments still quite didn't exist, still in the Renaissance as such, and eventually it's Donatello, as we will say, and Andrea del Verrocchio that were to create them. But these paintings were, however, being already showed as such. And the idea is the statue here is with a particular technique is rendered as if it was a bronze one, although it looks more like definitely as a marble statue. It's definitely meant to be a marble statue, but it's given this also the extra verde terra touch to look at as if it was also a bit bronzed. And you have this iconic element of the Condottiero holding the essentially a stick of command. This that was intended to be a sort of mace. You know that the mace in many cultures actually is a symbol of power and of command, because the mace, now it's complicated to explain. It's partly, in my opinion, related to the problem that mace is usually an ancient mace is very ancient as a weapon, and it was usually conceived to be a kind of an elite weapon, because of the idea that you have to fight against people who were kind of armored. And even sometimes you find you say that story of the bishops in the Middle Ages that had to hold this kind of club, because they were allegedly not supposed to shed blood. Well, it doesn't seem to have been true the case, because there is kind of a source that claims it is so, that was the reason, but seemingly this was not. It was something that went beyond it. It really wanted to stress the authority, the privilege of the bishop, just like others. Even William the Conqueror in the Bayeux Tapestry is holding a club, and that is something that goes very much beyond, and probably it didn't have this real classical symbolism, also because ecclesiastics, clergymen in the Middle Ages are witnessed to have used swords like anyone else, by the way. So this is also a bit of a secondary note that can be useful. So the stick of command is kind of a symbol of leadership. A scepter, say better, a rod. I said stick, it sounds bad, but it is a sort of scepter, a symbol of power. And John Oakwood is holding this scepter with one hand, and holding the reins of the horse with the other one. What is interesting about this painting also, it adds a little bit to the naturally, this is not a kind of a Roman horse. This is even like kind of a late medieval and kind of early modern horse style. So this also artistically represents kind of an advancement from the classical models. And you see here the horse is raising his paw, his leg. Sorry, I'm here trying to settle these damn wires that never stay the way they have to. Excuse me, I shift, so maybe this changes a little bit. And eventually this painting was criticized, especially by Vasari, who said, that it was kind of a mistake, because according to this position with the paw raised, the horse allegedly couldn't have stood on his own, in balance, but actually the correctness of this position eventually was stressed also by other authors. And however, the greater message that here the author wants to express is looking at this horse and its strength, his restlessness, his idea that the horse is this kind of dual animal. Usually war horses were pretty calm, pretty they were kind of robust, stout animals, but they were trained also to be obedient to particular breeds and so on. But the horse is a bit of this. First of all, no animal is equal to another. But this idea that it can be both something, an extremely reliable being, but at the same time also a very impetuous one, something that has an animal that has to be kind of dominated in its strength. So there is this sharp contrast that exists between the kind of this very physical and moving and motion-like horse, and instead the kind of the calm of the Condottieri. This is very important because it emphasizes the the confidence and the cold blood and the stout nerves that the Condottieri has, and that not even this huge, fantastic beast can shatter in its and this is very important because it basically embodies also metaphorically kind of the greatness of the reason that at this time in Renaissance warfare was being increasingly praised. I mean, the art of command, not going beyond what had been kind of medieval ethics, for which even the greatest commanders had to be essentially great warriors. That is, not necessarily great military minds that reasoned in a kind of an abstract and superior intellectual level, but just great fighters. So surely wise and also intelligent, but also very physically involved into the thing. Here it's like, and it's the horse represents the kind of the more dynamic, the more beast-like and side of war. This very physical thing, this very material thing. It is the idea of blood and dirt and of shock and of violence that the leader is able to dominate. And this work, in fact, was so successful, in fact, so admired, that it would inspire essentially also the further developments, not just of actually the equestrian status, not just other paintings, but also this tridimensional work. That in this sense also was being inspired. Look at the perspective in here. Perspective was being developed in these years, practically, and I've discussed that on that video on the Florentine rebirth in visual arts. So that's exactly what we were talking about there, and that was entailed. It entailed basically mathematical studies on perspectives, on geometry, and so on. These are all things that were being also rediscovered, or better revived and reanalyzed through the humanist studies of classical sources and so on. What else can we say about this? There is also kind of a surreal and enigmatic nature of this representation. Partly the perspective is probably not entirely correct, but it's just the also the dynamism of this figure on a funerary monument that usually was meant to actually show something much less dynamic, something way more static. I mean, usually the dead was resting in a kind of in perfect Christian fashion. Here instead, it's really the recovery of a quite strongly military message, military nature. That a bit all archaeologists and of the migration era know that, unfortunately for us, when the Germanic peoples got this Romano-Germanic Europe got Christianized fully, basically we stopped having weapons and armor buried into the graves. So we basically lose this great archaeological evidence. So you can argue from that point onwards, yeah, there had been great figures of, for instance, people were buried and with a funerary monument that showed their own equipment. So that starts being very useful. It starts essentially from already the high Middle Ages, and we're lucky to have that. But usually the warrior in there is represented like laying down, resting. In the Renaissance now there are many changes of this. There are statues, certain funerary monuments. If for instance, if you go into the to Saint Denis, so you see the tombs of French kings. Sometimes I think the one of Francis I is evidently, there is a kind of it's made of two levels. On the upper level you have Francis equipped with a full armor, full Renaissance war equipment, and then you have the lower ground in which you see him basically naked with just a veil, with a sudarium, and that was meant to represent the kind of the two faces of That is also it entails all the mystics of kingship, because that also meant to equate basically that there is a king that never dies. That there is the splitting of the basically of the personas of the king. When the physical one dies, the kind of the ideal kingships live on. That was particularly marked in countries like France and England. But what is meaningful in here is that you even have an equestrian statue, so something that goes very beyond. And you see the John Oakwood was very well alive in there. So it's more than that. It's a military ethos that goes past beyond that, let's say, and that wants this warrior to be what he had been in life, also in death. And this is very important because it entails kind of a more secular view of reality, for which there is something that really goes beyond. It's as if glory went beyond death, which is kind of an anti-Christian ideal, because the idea of Christianity is this constant humbling idea, for which like those other funerary monuments with the guy in full armor but still laying down as a corpse, want to say, okay, yeah, let's bury him like a military man, like he was, but he's still dead, and we have to show this because we are all that's ultimately the fate of all earthly. Even of glory and so on. So that's just a shell of what it was. Here instead, you have something very different. You have the full guy, living on even on horseback. So this is the recovery of also certain models that were kind of part of a past of European culture, if you want. This continuity of chivalry also. That I dedicated now several videos about the continuity of the chivalric ideals through the ages, and how this survived also from the mists of paganism into Christianity. And now, naturally, in this specific context, the idea, the Condottieri were mostly famous at this point. It was cavalry that was still a thing. In the first half of the 14th century, there had been a very strong revival of infantries in Europe that had brought even victories over mounted feudal armies. Then, with the Black Death, great part of this forces, of commoners' forces, wiped out, even literally, endemically speaking. So there was a sort of, in the late Middle Ages, a re-feudalization. And then exactly in these years, the Swiss were beginning to develop the square. What would be the Renaissance square of pikemen and so on. It would evolve, especially at the end of the 16th century, to become, and eventually, especially with the Spanish tercio, the model of kind of early modern warfare. But at this point, these guys were still instead largely fighting on horseback, like most of the other Europeans practically. So this was the concept of cavalry was something that went really beyond. It was a symbol of strength, of power, of political and military prestige still on the battlefields. And these guys fought mostly, definitely, on horseback. That was kind of the standard thing. And naturally, staying on horseback just looks cool. Let's be honest about it. So that was a kind of a great. You have to think this was a thanking monument. So it wasn't just a monument created out of the blue. There was a lot of emotional participation. I have seen this, by the way, when I was in Florence. When I saw it, it's an extraordinary experience. Like, I had a Stendhal syndrome when I went inside the Florentine Cathedral. It was one of the most devastating and emotional experiences I've ever felt. It rarely happens to me. But looking at all these things, it was like, wow. If I even think about it, you see my heartbeat kind of accelerates, because looking at so much beauty and so much meaning concentrated, also the thank to Dante and so on. So it's really heartbreaking. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful experience. Visit Florence because it really deserves. Obviously, it doesn't take me to say it, but it's way beyond what you expect. At least from my opinion. The idea, however, is that you still see that there is a sarcophagus that is kind of the pedestal of the same equestrian statue, and this there is this naturally inscription also that you can read in Latin, saying Ioannes acutus eques Britannicus dux aetatis excuse me, I lost the picture. Aetatis sue cautissimus et rei militaris peritissimus habitus est. It is full celebration of this, and also his origin, as he was an Englishman. And there is also on the side of the margin of the altar, you see here the signature of the artist Pauli Ugelli Opus. So it's a beautiful picture. You see here the very sense of volume with the chiaroscuro technique also that adds this kind of analytic realism to the shapes, to the forms, and it kind of synthesizes the whole figure. It's a very compact one. It's very, I mean, it's satisfying to watch it. Very plastic, very material indeed, very intense. And the idea, however, is that it still turns the picture in a bit of it's a very monumental one. I mean, you don't really feel it. It's very lifelike. It does look like a statue. Even the color here, you see, it renders it in. Also in here, it's an image. You know, it does look as if this guy was alive on horseback, but at the same time, it's as if it was frozen. And you can see in this death inherently, you know, having taken over, but it's still as if that had been frozen in the moment it was the might of its strength, of his life, of his power. And it's important also if you look at the light, because if you look at how this fresco is posed in the church, you realize that it's actually this fresco was designed to be to show light was in accordance with the one that was coming naturally from the windows of the church. So it also looks kind of in line with this. So having handed this, so at which we have to change here. Okay, 57. We pass to Andrea del Castagno instead. And looking at the same, in fact, what we were recalling before, at the same equestrian monument that for Niccolò da Tolentino that is present in the same cathedral of Florence. This was done 20 years after the work of Paolo Uccello in 1456. It's always on. It's also on the internal left wall of the cathedral, and it was in fact created at this point to be kind of in pendant with the equestrian monument to John Oakwood. So this fresco was basically dedicated to this other great Condottieri, who was captain of the Florentine militias at the Battle of San Romano in 1432, 4 years before. That was this essentially kind of Florentine victory, substantially. It was celebrated in also other works. And this was a victory over basically Siena, Lucca, and Milan. And the Niccolò da Tolentino had been this condottiero and soldier of fortune, who was in service at the time for Florence. And it took actually Niccolò had died from 20 years at that point actually. And Niccolò, in fact, had died in the same. No, actually not. In 1435. So even 1 year before, actually, the monument of John Oakwood was finished practically. Was realized, and so even it's interesting this kind of lapse in time for which certain condottieri were celebrated after, not just after they had died, but even after a generation, like in this case. Also, this fresco was restored some time, and actually it was also basically literally shifted and brought away. I mean, it's a bit of complicated, but looking at the relocated, I mean, but looking at the description of the style, let's say the equestrian monument is naturally very similar to the one we've seen from the one from John Oakwood, and it's similar in the essential, still differs a little bit. It's still monochromatic, so it's meant to represent a marble monument of this sarcophagus / pedestal that represents the burial of the Condottieri, and it's definitely realized in a kind of evidently classical style. It's the perspective also in here is a bit, probably even a bit better than the one from the monument of John Oakwood. And excuse me, there is something here that is I have to reload. Yeah, okay. And it's very it's interesting because it's there are certain differences. There are two naked figures with coats of arms you can see on the side of the sarcophagus, and there is a bit of a strange effect for which, if you look at the horse, it's kind of especially the head and so on, it doesn't look very stable. It's as if it was falling down, and this was also partly wanted, and there is also this precarium balance that you see from the palp that is the left one that is at this point is raised, and this kind of pace of the horse that seems to be advancing. The horse is particularly big if you look at it, and it's at this point, telling the truth, the monument that we'll see later of the equestrian statue of Gattamelata made by Donatello was already created, so this is actually inspired to this. And surely Andrea del Castagno had been in Padua at that point and had seen it, and at least he had seen some of the many drawings that existed now had been realized about that particular work. And what you find similar to the monument of John Oakwood is that the Condottieri is absolutely not is kind of very sure of himself. It looks very, very proud and self-confident and fixed towards our direction. Here's he's pointing straight ahead. So he's very determined and also kind of thoughtful. He's thinking about what he has to do. He's looking at his objective probably and thinking how to do it. Look at this beautiful hat. It's very ornate, elaborated, and look at also at the horse tail. It's so kind of flying, just like the mantle that is moving, and so it's actually a very elegant and refined work of art. Even if and this is very important because it goes a bit beyond if the work of Paolo Cello is a bit, as we've seen, a bit rigid in itself. And this picture that is practically similar to it, is much more dynamic. In the excuse me, the Condottieri and the knight kind of the Condottieri and the horse look like very much more fluid. There is more dynamism in the figure, and it adds up to it doesn't seem like a statue proper anymore. It looks more like a lifelike figure in terms of movement, of dynamism. And this is part of a broader current that was happening in Florentine art. It was wanted to emphasize a bit more a bit of a elegant and refined style than just this cold classical thing. And it went towards new forms and representations. Also in here you have a good, substantially anatomic representation, and intense chiaroscuro as well, and it looks a bit. I mean, this was criticized even by Vasari, because he's basically said that that it looked a bit too metallic. Even if you look at the brittles, the wall figure, it looks objectively a bit kind of mechanic in it. I mean, it's very fluid and plastic as a structure, but if you look at the even here at the barding, I don't know how to say that, the harness, it's a bit kind of like a bit of a net of a cage. I don't know how to say that properly. So it was criticized aesthetically by someone. However, I like it personally. Even though I like more the one from the monument from for John Oakwood. And okay, also in here there is a writing, but no, it's getting too long. Let's pass on. So let me switch in here the number of the date, and we pass to actually another a bit of a different thing from Leon Battista Alberti that we also commented on that other video of the on the Florentine visual arts renewed. And this is just a picture of the so-called Malatesta temple, or Tempio Malatestiano, which is this basically this major church in Rimini, where the Malatesta lordship was ruling at the time. This was basically, I think it existed on a previous foundation, actually, so the church was much older, but under Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta this was completely renewed. And so, in fact, the work in here of certain great artists, including Alberti and Matteo de Pasti and Agostino di Duccia and even Piero della Francesca, that we'll see also later for the portrait to the Malatesta, I believe. No, we won't see it. Or yes. Oh no, we will see it for in fact the portraits of the Dukes of Montefeltro, actually. They're also beautiful. Also here it's more, now it's a bit complicated to explain actually what this church has. But it's definitely inspired also in here to classical models, and you maybe here from the picture you can't quite see it, but look at the columns, these arcs, and it was meant to be inspired to Platonic ideals. So it's in the full Renaissance ideal of this kind of sacred space that now was kind of overlapping Neoplatonism that was being studied and renewed and rediscovered by the humanists at this point very intensely, also in the harmonic proportions of art and numbers, and so on. But what is interesting in here is that there was also a dome in here. Was this was basically dedicated to Saint Sigismund, who was the patron of the committant, Sigismund Pandolf Malatesta, in fact. And this was started being built in 1447. and the works actually went on for several years. And here it's a bit complicated to explain how really the structure really went to be built. However, there is importantly this rotunda that was added to the extremity of the church that was covered by a dome, imitating the one of the Pantheon. And Alberti started working on this in 1453. And the wall work was not actually completed. And so the main thing here is that the wall plan is very unusual for a Christian church. In the decorative apparatus, at least the original one, you find that the traditional religious references are very much reduced and even sometimes absent. So this looks really like a temple theoretically, and this was built by Malatesta as for his own tomb, one of his family, and for the dignitaries that were close to him in his lordship. So this was a celebration of basically of him and of his house, and this was openly recalling to a complex language that was typical of paganism. That's hence the name temple. So this was actually a bit of a problem, because this also strained the relation with the Pope Pius II Piccolomini, and that eventually ended up to excommunicate to 1460. Actually, not just because, obviously not just because of the temple, but because of other relations. For instance, other problems like the fact that Malatesta fought as a commander against Siena. It was the original city of Pius II. And actually the same Pope wrote in one of his commentaries that talking about Malatesta that he had built this noble temple in Rimini in honor of Saint Francis actually, but he filled it with so many pagan works that it didn't look like a Christian temple, but of infidels and adorers of the demons practically. So this was excuse me. This said by a pope that was also kind of a humanist in himself. So this is kind of meaningful as well. But once again, what lays beyond this symbol is that such a great commander like Sigismund was at this point very much interested in this kind of type of Neoplatonic and kind of intellectual and idealistic models that were so certain compenetrating to the things like ethos and pathos. So also in here stressing the kind of the ideal and the physical dimension of reality, like you find also in, for instance, in the monument of John Awkward. So this difference between Apollo and Dionysus, that is at the base of human reality. You have to think if these soldiers really looking at life and this contrast between life and death, between light and darkness, it's something that was very much felt. So it's very fascinating that you find these men of war that spent their life among spilling guts and blood and all this stuff that were, however, so aesthetically refined in many ways. It's a way into which this world was kind of also trying to elevate itself from the brutality in which it was usually and normally dwelling. And there were also certain treatises that were written at this time were about the war that, however, commented on this temple, interestingly enough. Now, I can quit with this, just maybe a word about Sigismund that we didn't introduce properly. And I can put in here a another picture. If you give me a second, I'm marking here. One 1436. So here's a portrait actually that I didn't want to put into the list today, but it's equally important because it's being realized by Piero della Francesca, that we will see later also for the portrait that made of the Dukes of Urbino. And in fact, it's pretty similar. But this dates basically to 1415. So Sigismund was he was actually born in 1470. He died in 1478. He was in 1470, and he was Lord of Rimini and Fano. There were these the cities basically in this area of Romagna. These were the Romagnol dynasties that had lordships that had been also much pretty fluid. Romagna was an area that historically produced lots of condottieri because it was relatively poor, a bit fragmented politically speaking, and therefore it was full of these houses of noblemen that sold their services since a very early age to the wealthier, especially Tuscan, but also Lombard cities, and that made a fortune through it. And this is how they raised. By the way, these were kind of a military families, so they were also very feudal in mindset with certain standards. Not all of them, because some of them also rose from a non-feudal context. But this was the thing about Italian nobility, that it was really fluid in many ways. And these dynasties were also kind of plagued by internal strife, by dynastic contentions, and so on. It was a bit of a problem, but it stresses the importance of the dynasty in itself. So these weren't kind of, it wasn't much like the cities of Rimini and Fano and kind of systems, but it was just the individual lordship of this man. Differently from other lordships that maybe were centered on a dynastic base, but however they had a very strongly solid regional base. At this point, it was this relatively small cities that were supporting this lordship. It also had land and wealth elsewhere, in castles, also in countryside, and so on. And Sigismund is famous and worth of a mention simply because he was one of the greatest and boldest military commanders of the time in Italy as a condottiero, and he participated to many battles that defined that period historically. And he's also in fact mostly famous also because of his patronage of the arts. And for having embellished the city of Rimini, that was the center of his power, all these kind of intelligentsia of artists and scholars that were among the most prized of the peninsula at the time. And he was in fact chronically usually out of money because of this, because he had this huge ambition and he wanted to show off. The typical lord of the time, well, financial problems at the time were kind of the standards for every power and for it, because in the general political and social dynamics, I mean, the problems have always been money, historically speaking. So, and that's the reason why he made a living out of the craft of war. So also he switched flag quite often because of this, and this was in fact a business. And progressively, however, this unfaithfulness that was, however, dictated by pragmatism, not by vocation, eventually brought him to be isolated, and he had many enemies who tried to crush him. He was also enemy with Federico da Montefeltro, we'll see later. So it's very interesting because the same Piero della Francesca, the author of this painting you see now, did also a painting for the Montefeltro, for Federico himself. And the Montefeltro were based in Urbino instead. They were actually close, and they governed the city of Pesaro. It was very close to the Malatesta domains, and that basically he wanted to acquire, so to unify Romagna in the Marches and extend his power in this region of the Adriatic Sea. And but he didn't succeed. Pandolfo, Sigismund didn't succeed. And at the same time, he at this point there is this major phenomenon in this major episode in Italian history dedicated a video to, which is the Peace of Lodi in 1454. If you wait a second, I give you the title of the video, so that if you're interested about the political situation of the time, it's very important. The title is Italy from the Peace of Lodi to Charles VIII's Invasion, 1454-1494. So this is 40 years of Italian history. They're very kind of interesting and intense, even though they kind of froze a bit the military activities. Well, this was a major agreement, the creation of the Italic League. Basically, the major Italian powers set, after literally hundreds of years of war, a kind of repartition of the spheres of influences to freeze war, because it had been seen that basically they couldn't prevail over one another, so they preferred to remain in this balance. It was actually quite turbulent as well. And Sigismund, because of all his enemies, was practically marginalized by the peace treaty, and he ended up to be unavoidably a minor power, and so on. So there is this kind of contrast between his individual greatness and, however, the fact that he was a loser in the end. And this is also typical, and there was also naturally a lot of moral didactic examples of this, also based on the classical works that, and also mixed with Christian ideals. So the idea that of the greater one that, however, is brought down eventually. And in fact, as we were saying before, he also was excommunicated by Pope Pius II Piccolomini, and he eventually ended up to lose great part of his own territories. And he kind of died in kind of a miserable condition. And I wish we could concentrate more about him. But now we pass actually to his rivals, since poor Sigismund, we're going to humiliate him, but at least we talk about him before them. So here I sign. Yeah. Okay. And we pass to this other artist, in fact, we just mentioned, that is Piero della Francesca, in these beautiful portraits that are actually pretty famous. These are this is called actually the double portrait of the Dukes of Urbino. It's a diptych, as you see. Is a oil on canvas, and it's basically representing the two I don't know how you say it in English, when two people are married. This poses, well, maybe this is the right term, Federico da Montefeltro and Battista Sforza. We don't really know where this painting was realized. There is this range between 1465 and 1472, and you can see this masterpiece at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. So this is probably one of the most famous portraits of the Italian Renaissance. It was painted in Urbino proper, in this precise moment, and although it seems that this was realized actually in two phases, because it seems that in 1465, as early as that, actually the Federico's portrait was already realized. So the husband was already done, obviously, because also he was more important at that time. And whereas Battista Sforza, his wife, was seemingly this painting was realized when she was already dead. and she died in I think 1472, and so this might have been in fact painted the same day of her death. Battista was the daughter of Alessandro Sforza, who had been Lord of Pesaro, so you remember, and of his first wife, who was a Davarano, who was another family that ruled over. She was also a poetess. She was a person of great interest. So these lordships were all kind of intermarried because of their dynastic interests, their patrimonial strategies. So also women in this phase had a huge importance as sometimes even as lords on their own. I mean, sometimes the widows of these lords, when they were especially raising their own minor kids, they had a huge importance. Think about Caterina Sforza, for instance, some of the greatest women of the time, actually also as political and even military commanders, because they fought intensely, also as in certain occasions, were so had a huge importance in this context, politically speaking. And sadly, Battista died when she gave birth to, as many women, unfortunately, at the time, when she gave birth, in fact, to her son, Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, who was to become, in fact, the third Duke of Urbino. He was kind of a he also died relatively young, but Battista died when she was only 27. Relatively, well, not excessively young for the time, because usually women were married and they started having children very early at that point, even in their 14, 15, something like that. But however, these were the risks of birth at the time, and some people have the problem with the dating maybe is not so important after all, but the important is this celebrative nature of this working. And we actually don't know where this work was realized. There's so many different hints from certain sources, and we don't clearly understand what was that. And there is actually a debate because the picture you have seen before about Sigismund Malatesta seemingly is very similar, definitely. So as it was represented by the same author, but even the style suggests that there might have been some kind of, that the Duke of Montefeltro wanted wanted to emulate, so that we're kind of competing with each other for having something that looked similar essentially to one another, so independently from what the artist wanted to represent, because they were naturally commissioned. Excuse me, I drink a little bit once again. By the way, we didn't say that the portrait of Sigismund was painted probably at the same time which the Malatesta temple was edified. So before, roughly, perhaps 1451. And this was this painting was this portrait was exposed in the ducal palace of Urbino. Then eventually it was collected by the Della Rovere, and after the extinction of this house, they came in the 17th century through the dowry of Vittoria della Rovere in 1631, in fact, the last heiress of the Della Rovere, to Ferdinand II de' Medici. So the Medici eventually inherited partly this works of art because of this channel. Then eventually this portrait was part of the Royal Galleries in the 18th century, and eventually now it's in the Uffizi proper. And it's very interesting because at that point, this work of art had been relatively forgotten, because basically nobody even knew who these guys were at that point. In fact, in this late modern age, it was believed to be a portrait of Petrarch and Laura. So this ideal literary, the Petrarch obviously existed. Laura was his loved one, and she might have been actually a literary invention, but I don't think so personally. Also because I terribly love Petrarch in that relation. But so it's important because this great work of art of the Renaissance basically had been lost in the memory, and now people couldn't even understand that it was actually depicting the Montefeltro family. So you looking at the technique, well, this maybe not excessively interesting, but there is, especially the technique of oil. At this point, it might have been a Flemish influence. In fact, this portrait has strong Flemish influence on style. I personally love Flemish painting, and it's objectively true. There are certain, as much as I love Piero della Francesca, by the way, there are certain features that recall this, and indeed at Urbino there were certain Flemish painters that were working for the dynasty, and especially it seems that Jos van Wassenhoven was working at that time in Urbino as well. So naturally you see also this European dimension of this art, because these Italian lordships were not just an Italian thing. We discussed many times how basically at this point the political balance of the peninsula was dictating the European politics as a whole. You know, everybody from England, Burgundy, France, Austria, Spain were all deeply concerned with what was happening in Italy, because the shift of even a lordship from one side or another, or obviously the weakening of one, strengthening of another, could really shift the whole European balance, and this triggered many other things. That's how eventually the Wars of Italy practically started with the French invasion, that eventually to engulf the whole continent. In fact, if they initially were fought in Italy, then eventually most of the fights were towards the end in the Low Countries. And definitely Italy and the Low Countries at this point were pretty much in contact. And artistically speaking, it was a great dialogue all over. So it was also a very good opportunity for these Flemish painters to go in Italy to learn what was done there, and also for these Italian painters to learn from these Flemish artists. Today, these two portraits are actually physically separated, but originally they at least had a unique frame, so they were still, as we've seen, realized in two different points, but they were put together. And the problem, and it would explain also why it was lost kind of track of this painting and why it wasn't recognized anymore for what it was, is that it might have been a sort of private object. You know, it was exposed at that point in the palace, but it might have been more of a personal portrait than a public one. And especially there is this inherent problem of the fact that naturally seemingly Federico loved his wife very, very much. So there was this emotional side of it, for which this portrait maybe wanted to be a bit more of a kind of a personal thing. And in fact, if you look at the painting, you realize it's beautiful to watch, but it's still kind of melancholic. I mean, the whole tone of the painting is a bit. Piero and Francesca are usually painted in such a kind of a very I don't even know how to define it, but not really emotionless fashion, but in a way it's basically even mystic, and even here there's a big deal of Neoplatonism in his work. in a way that it's a bit ideal. It's a bit cold. So if you look at the picture, and also in here you see also there's two major figures over this background, and now we will comment, that are a bit static, bit motionless, and this might have had to do also with the sadness that followed the death of Battista Sforza, and this essentially funerary painting that therefore it was meant to remember her. So these figures are definitely idling. In fact, these profiles look very much like those artistic representations over medals. This idling is solemn. There's a very bright light. A light bright. I meant bright light, of course. And there is this very evident contrast between the foreground and background, in especially looking at the horizon. In here you can find this Renaissance studies on the not just some perspective, but the idea of sight, what you can see in the background. Look at on the background these mountains close to the horizons that look like kind of azurine blue. That is objectively the color you see when, because of the atmosphere, optical effects on the distance. It was being studied at this time in art and so on. So it's as if this brought actually metaphorically to a greater contrast between what is very close and what is very far. That has to do naturally with also this idea of life and death. There is a bit of this dichotomy in art at this time, and also in here of the symbolism, the particular meaning of the painting naturally has. But at the same time, these two different dimensions are very much blended together. They're very much connected, at least. So this was a Neoplatonic ideal that naturally looked at this superior and ordered reality that was dominated by mathematical laws, like the ones that are being used in here in perspective and also in the representation of the physical world, but that within which the human beings are framed, so that it's as if the human dimension participated in spite of its mortality and of its inherent imperfection. Look at, for instance, the verrucas on Federico's face, to perfection. So it's a very humanistic ideal, and it's as if they and this could be achieved naturally in Neoplatonic and also in Christian terms, because there's also Christian symbolism in part to moral superiority. So it doesn't matter whether we're human nature is kind of sinful, it's weak and it has a fault. The important thing is it's the moral tension. So it's not about matter, it's about spirit. And what you can see is that there is a kind of a warm light overall. I mean, also the physical side of the human beings in here is kind of here. The two figures are very plastic in the way that they're represented. They're very colored as well. The light is very warm, almost reddish, and and it's coming actually from the right side. If you look at especially at the shadows on Federico's face, you realize this. If you look at Battista, she has a very light complexion, and this belonged. This was this idea that the etiquette of the time basically prescribed, especially women, to have this constant obsession for whitening their faces. Sometimes using certain cosmetics that even eroded their faces, so they they even kind of got disfigured at one point, but it was something very, very important at the time for fashion, or the way it was considered. So that it had to represent the, the purity of the color of white it entailed. This the idea is that it was this Germanic ideal for which the whiter you were, essentially, the more you descended from the nobility. That in feudal terms, the idea is that there was even a sort of proto. There was a eugenetic ideal, essentially, for which if you descended from those families of a noble blood, the idea of blue blood is the fact that the whitest people have this kind of veins showing up. If you look at my left arm, there's a huge kind of bluish greenish vein. It is kind of bad, and it's and this is meant, you descend from those stocks originally that were, the Germanic rulers. It was kind of this weird thing that also people don't like to talk about because it kind of sounds as proto-racist, but objectively at the time eugenics was conceived also in this ways. And now, not very much now in late medieval times, it was mostly an early medieval things, but still in fashion this was kind of maintained. But there was also another addition to this, because the idea is that you were quite white, not much because of a genetic matter, but because of it was in contrast with the peasants that usually worked on under the sunlight the whole day, so they were tanned. And this idea is that the more you were tanned, and the more you were kind of a, especially for women, because obviously men, just like Federico, as soldiers, went campaigning all the summer, so they would get tanned. But the idea, especially for women, and the woman has to be inside. And for the whitest she looked, and the more this was the idea she was coming from. Yeah, I know it's a weird aesthetical taste, but it's like that. And also another thing in Battista's appearance is her very high forehead. That was also typical female fashion of the time. The idea of putting your hair all up to show your the forehead. And this and for this reason, basically the line, your hairline was burnt with fire, with a candle, so that you could basically have this higher forehead. And naturally, her hairstyle is very elaborated. This was also part of the fashion. And what else? There are many jewels, naturally, in very expensive clothes, and so on. And Piero della Francesca here, in fact, seems to have been influenced by the Flemish style, because in Flemish painting, if you're acquainted with it, there is a huge emphasis put on these gems and pearls, and this idea of that also the oil technique now was kind of emphasizing the reflexes, the shiny of the surface. And it was basically making you able to identify the matter of the object from the light, and how life was reflected on the surface. It was very sophisticated. Looking at these two pictures, you have to think that the model was also this cameos from Roman times. And consular diptychs in ivory. And in fact the inscription that is posed here starts with I think Clarus and Virorum. So this was the idea of the Vir Clarissimus. That was typical of late Roman world, when they wanted to stress essentially the noble status of a person from a social point of view. This is important because in Italian lordships, as we said, these titles were kind of these lordships were kind of rising relatively. The Montefeltro were a very noble family, but at this point it was the idea that these lordships were acquired also through a sort of merit and of prestige that went beyond even such things. So this is also the kind of the classicization of the Renaissance culture, even in political practice and in art and so on. Passing at Federico is possibly the most interesting theme, the most interesting object. You see a much higher degree of naturalism. We have spotted before. He has this very stout figure. He has this also the color of red is very bloody. It's very lifelike. Both the cap and the cloth, and he has a kind of a curly hair, and he has a very kind of proud look, and he's looking straight away, and there is this very famous thing about Federico's nose, because basically he had this curved nose, but if you look at it on the top, it's broken. It wasn't really like that, and the reason why it was so, it's because basically he had his nose smashed during a tournament in which he had also lost his right eye. So seemingly, there were people who even said basically in order to watch with the left eye also right, he had his nose broken, but it's not really, I mean, to look past it, but it's not really, I mean, as a commander to have a better eyesight. It's fascinating, but I don't think it's an historical thing. However, he didn't want to be represented without his right eye, so that's why he's on. He was always portrayed, also in other works, or always from the left side. So the skin is particularly detailed, and it's very, as we've seen, very, very, very realistic. We have seen the verrucas in certain beauty spots, and this also was a Flemish, probably a Flemish habit. I mean, to represent these details. And at this point, consider that the court of Montefeltro was extremely prestigious, so it was very famous also abroad, and that's where there were so many Flemish artists working shoulder to shoulder with Italian ones. There are also, now maybe this is not, I don't remember which picture I've placed in here. Do you see the triumphs in here? No. Okay, well, maybe we don't comment them. This is not actually a full picture. There are also other elements that go with certain allegorical figures that represent essentially they're typical the humanistic world. It was actually a classical legacy, and there were also certain medieval influences from, for instance, the work of Petrarch had brought through that. And maybe we go past it, but well, it's kind of interesting. Wait a second, I switch. I'm showing them to you. Okay, let's do this. What it is? 148. This is a pretty long video. Yeah. So basically, this. Wait a second. Where are we? These two pictures represent Frederick, who is portrayed on the chariot of the triumph. It's more of a cart rather than a chariot, and this is kind of in fact the hybrid between the classical and medieval tradition, with a winged victory that is basically crowning him with the laurel. So perfectly in classical fashion. And on the first side of the chariot are sitting in the four cardinal virtues that are renownedly justice. The one who has was in the front with a sword and a libra, essentially. Prudence with a mirror in the profile, and fortitude, essentially fortress strength, with the broken column, and temperance. By looking, giving you basically turning back. And then there is a little Eris that is guiding the horses. And even though who is really leading the chariot is Frederick himself, that is wearing an armor, and also in here, like we've seen in the other equestrian portraits, he's using a scepter. That is also what else can Clarus, there is a writing, it says, Clarus insigne veitur triumpho quem parem summis ducibus perennis fama virtutum celebrat decenter sceptra tenentem, which basically it says he's brought in with the ensigns of triumph that illustrious man, practically, whose fame remains perennial in his own virtue, and it remains perennial of his virtue, and celebrates worthily as a holder of a scepter that is basically at the same level of the greatest commanders, practically, of those who hold the scepter, whatever. And there is a triumph also for Battista, interestingly instead, and this is instead emphasizing the marriage, essentially the wifely virtues, and she is cultured because she is reading, and she has these three theological virtues instead, and that are charity, that is wearing in black with a the pelican on her womb was basically the symbol of the maternal sacrifice, considered that she had died of birth. So and because the pelican basically eats allegedly, this was sort of his own flesh for feeding his her own cubs, substantially, and the faith that she's wearing red, and with the essentially the stem, the wine glass of the host. There is hope also. She's turning back in here, and the temperance also in here that she's looking front, and the arrows in here instead is leading to leocorns that represent chastity, and the inscription says, Quae modum rebus tenuit secundis coniugis magni decorata rerum laude gestarum volitat per ora cuncta virorum, which means she who maintains basically moderation in favorable circumstances flies over all the mouths of men, and adorns the basically of praise the deeds of her great husband. So this is naturally, and you realize that here the triumph symbolism that is all one with the idea of glory in itself, and probably the author of these writings was objectively the same Piero della Francesca as a writer, and now we pass back to the landscape instead. I think it's quite interesting that is clearly derived from the Flemish tradition in here, and you see this mist where the azurine atmosphere you can see in the background. And it looks as if it was a dome. You're looking at the light, especially rising from the horizons. It's really, the idea of the rebirth of another day, of the light rising once again. And it would be now the triumphs basically have been also thought of being intersected with the portraits for having this 360 degrees view. However, the most important thing is that basically this view is meant to represent what it could be seen from the panoramic tower, western tower of the ducal palace of Urbino, and you can see all of these beautiful hills with different towers and castles and fertile valleys. It's the typical medieval Italian countryside. You can see worked lands, and a sort of basin that would mean to open to the sea, where there are several working ships, which is a symbol naturally of the economical, fitness of the duchy. So going on, and here I change once again. We see instead another work from the monument, the equestrian monument to Gattamelata. This is definitely probably one of the most beautiful military representations of the time. This is a bronze statue that is being realized by Donatello, that we discussed extensively as an author in that video on the Florentine visual arts, that are definitely important, as he just check out that video. It can be interesting to add a bit of detail. And this statue was interestingly erected in the central square of the church square of Padua. And this was erected in honor of the Condottieri of the Venetian Republic, Erasmo da Narni, called the Gattamelata, and nicknamed Gattamelata. And he and we don't know also here when precisely it was built, but between 1446 and 1453. It's actually relatively big. I mean, it's like 3.4 for 3.9 meters, and also the base of the column is pretty big. It's like 7 meters, almost 8 meters per 4, so it's kind of a big thing. And this is very important in history of art in general, because it's basically, at least as we know, but I think there is not much of a doubt, the first equestrian statue of great dimensions that had been cast since the time of antiquity, and definitely one of the first sculptural works of modern age that were basically completely independent from a architectonical integration. Because usually these statues were in medieval times were even within a niche or something in architecture. So this is instead a self-standing statue, an autonomous thing that basically is standing in space without limits, and really representing itself and nothing else. So this was done made by Donatello at this point, and he had basically left Florence in 1443. That was the year of death of the Gattamelata. Although this is not really sure in history, as at this point also Donatello. This is something that Vasari says. Vasari says a lot of things because he wrote basically this work on the life of these new artists of his time. And the Donatello was working also on everything, so probably he started, however, to work not before 1446, as we said before. And the main problem here was creating the models initially for casting actually both the horse and the knight. They're actually casted separately, and this was a kind of a technological achievement at the time. It's not indifferent, and what you see, first of all, it's a perfectly classical work. So it's naturally inspired, as we were saying before, also to the equestrian study of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, and this work ended in 1453. And at this point, Donatello left Padua, and he got a freaking lot of money from this. Something like I don't know what's the measure into. But it would be something like 1,650 ducats. That is a freaking lot of money at the time, and objectively it was well deserved. So it's seemingly in here there is a debate, because we don't really know. It seems that the cost, who paid for this, because this is very important at political level. Seemingly the great part of this money was paid by the widow of Gattamelata, Giacomo Boccarini Brunori, and she was, by the way, the sister of another famous Condottieri, was Gentile da Leonessa. So it's interesting also Condottieri intermarried, in their families. I mean, intermarried with the families of other Condottieri meant. But it seems that also the Venetian Senate participated to the payment, and naturally you have to understand that the Venetian government at this time had also to authorize the creation of a monument in here in the square of the Santo. This is if you go to Padua, this is basically in the front of the church of the Saint Anthony of Padua. It's also a beautiful church. If you go there to visit, you can realize it. So this is just in there. So it was a very bold thing that naturally represents this kind of conscious. Naturally, it's loaded with meanings. The idea of the condottiero, the warrior that defends, and also the church in front. But it's really important here that a condottiero was represented so clamorously in a way that had never been done, as a kind of a permanent figure of that particular environment, of that particular political context. And naturally, there were many political meanings to this. It was a public work. We don't really know who was involved in this. This is the main point. We don't have a clear idea of the of who was who, because naturally there are many people who insist on the fact that this was largely a private. This was financed privately by the family, by the heirs of Gattamelata. But seemingly, the fact that, however, this work was allowed, and also partly that the Republic of St. Mark participated to the expenses, it's very meaningful, and and it tells so much on how this had. This figure had been important for the history of even of Venice in itself. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And the interesting thing about this is that this monument isn't even properly part of the funerary chapel of Gattamelata. Instead, is I think it's inside. It's inside Saint Anthony. There is another monument of Gattamelata that actually represents him in a very different fashion from the one it appears on the outside. It's a typically military one, whereas the internal funerary monument is more. He's actually excuse me. He's wearing armor, and there is also the sword in there, but at least he's laying down in a more typical, traditional fashion of a knight being buried and showing as if he was dead on his deathbed, essentially. and we won't comment on that thing, but it's still kind of interesting to look at. It would be to look at that too, but this is not important now. However, the important thing is that it's in fact a self-standing statue outside as a public representation, so as a celebration of someone who had done something great for that republic. And in this sense, it's represented as the first public work that was purely celebrative. And the Gattamelata had not been actually quite particularly victorious leader at the time, but it still obtained this favor, given that this equestrian monument had up to that point been only accepted for more famous figures like noblemen or sovereigns and so on. And in fact, there was a lot of criticism and also of satire on this, because it was there was even when Donatello was still alive, it was said that the horse that he represented was the same one that Gattamelata used to run away during the battles, and that a word of Erasmo from Narni is called the Gattamelata. He was initially at the service of Republic of Florence, then eventually of the Papal States, and eventually at the Republic of Venice, where he obtained the charge of Captain General. And he was actually a good commander, but in itself, it's just he wasn't always successful. So he actually successfully defended Venice from the attacks of Milan, and he also managed to conquer the city of Verona, interestingly enough. Now we might concentrate more on him, but the most interesting thing are the models. As we have said, there was a tradition in the Venetian area of equestrian statues on funerary monuments. There were smaller. For instance, the Della Scala tombs are kind of showing that, and some of the most beautiful. Also, one of the most beautiful, most important sources for the armor early 14th century are depicted in there. And there had been also other drawings in painting. For instance, before we have seen the John Oakwood of Paolo Uccello, but there was also the painting of Guido Riccio da Fogliano that had been realized by Simone Martini at the time. He had been this was a contemporary work of Guido Riccio in the first half of the 14th century. This had been one of the first Condottieri actually. It had fought for Siena essentially. But the interesting thing is that Donatello at this point didn't actually got inspired by these previous models more than much, and really the decisive inspiration came from Marcus Aurelius and the late Roman statue that existed in Pavia, that was the Regisole, that is unfortunately lost because it was destroyed in 1796 by the Pavese Jacobins during the revolutions, because it basically represented a monarch. It represented, we don't know whom actually. Someone said it was Theodoric the Great representing it, but it's not. Others thought it was Charlemagne. We don't really know, but this was beautiful statue eventually was destroyed, and that existed, however, at the time in the Middle Ages for Donatello to know it. And there is also great influence probably from the horses of the famed Quadriga of St. Mark, that was instead a work that was taken by the Venetians from Constantinople. Probably the most famous one is these horses in gold and bronze and golden and silver bronze. And they we don't really know where it came from. Usually these were horses that were used over the triumphal arcs of antiquity. People said this came from the hippodrome of Constantinople, but we don't really know. frankly. They could belong also to other. And the Venetians had taken freaking lot of this stuff. You know, while the other crusaders in 1204 had mostly devastated the city, the Venetians were clever enough to take away instead all these works of art from the ancient times. So there are all these influences that contributed to create this very first important achievement in Renaissance art of this equestrian, self-standing equestrian state of large dimensions. But the important is that Donatello here did something completely different. He basically he was inspired also by reality in itself. This is important of Renaissance art. He went beyond the models. It wasn't just a mere. Sometimes people think that the Renaissance is just literally copying ancient art. This is not true. The Renaissance went beyond. It wasn't a passive process, and this is actually the beauty of the Renaissance. Not the fact many people like the Renaissance because they say, "Oh, well, they came back doing things that like the Romans said, so they are cool." No, they went beyond, and the Middle Ages had loaded very much this in meaning and in refining this ability of changing it. And for instance, there is this evident modern characteristics in the statue that didn't exist in the classical equestrian statues. Of course, that there was a saddle and stirrups, just for example. I mean, a medieval saddle, also the Roman saddle, excuse me, a saddle, but it wasn't like the ones that were used by the Condottieri in the 15th century. So, what is amazing of this work is basically manages to blend two things. That there is very powerful idealization of the knight, but also very strong realism. So this statue is extremely expressive, and this doesn't have to do just with for the figure of the horseman, but also of the horse itself. And and there is a lot of psychology in this that is very important. It's not just a cold. There is a lot of psyche into this as well, and this makes naturally the statue being interpreted in several ways, in several different ways. This statue, by the way, was located in a very peculiar place. There, because it basically was at the crossroads. I mean, there were several perspectives you could see it from, so it was really in the center to be watched from different direction. So we can start from the horse, actually. So this is also another massive animal. It's a war horse, and it's evidently also in here very in tension. It's really trembling, quivering. It's an kind of a agitated, unsettled animal, and this is meant to symbolize its strength, its animal-like side. And actually, the horse, in proportion, is to the knight, is a bit larger. This it's believed to have been actually done on purpose, because the author wanted to represent, to emphasize the strength of the animal. So even making it actually bigger than it would have been in reality, compared to the knight. So the implicit meaning is that the Condottieri at this point was capable of riding such a big thing. You know, the idea. You know, horses are already kind of big animals on their own. You know, if you go close to a horse, you can't avoid to be impressed by it. Just think of riding something that was even bigger. It's like, you know, you're riding kind of a force of nature in many ways. So the bridles, the saddle, and other modern ornaments are really show that the Donatello was going to represent other things that were in fact um, was going beyond, to represent a current knight, not a Roman one. Also in here, the idea was that the hoof of the horse was raised. And the over perhaps a sphere. We don't know what it was, but or it could have been a cannonball at that point. And this was meant to create an equilibrium, a static equilibrium to this statue. And actually the risen hoof is the risen paw is also meant to symbolize that the Condottieri was killed in battle. And in fact he the whatever, this is maybe not important, but there is all this kind of allegorical symbolism behind this figure that is meant to go beyond even the same biography of the Condottieri, and meaning naturally so many other things about the greatness that stands also in the human dimension in itself. And the horse head is moving. So this hand is kind of wild nature, is looking there. The horse is very active object, but he's also a very smart, autonomous animal, so it stresses this. But also in here, like we've seen for the other equestrian symbols, the equestrian statues, the Condottieri is actually calming he's calm. He's basically ruling the animal. He's not seemingly having difficulty with it, and the hand which he holds the reins is not even very much contracted. He's very light. He's confident. He knows what he's doing. He knows how to lead his horse, how to ride him. And this obviously has an hidden message that inherently hints at the victory in itself. The idea that mankind wins over nature through his own intelligence, basically. And in fact, if you look at him, the Condottieri has this kind of he looks kind of serious and stern, and he also here holds the scepter of command. That was in here probably the one that was offered to him by the Republic of Venice in 1438, and his armor is kind of a bit more fantasy-like, because in here it's the only element basically that recalls a bit this classical style that Donatello decided to integrate, because obviously if you look at this statue, the concept of the armor is maybe kind of realistic, but if you look at the details and how it's actually built, this is not a real 15th century armor. It's something very different and kind of reinvented a little bit. And Gattamelata has his legs standing on the stirrups, looking far away, and he keeps in his hand the scepter in a kind of oblique direction that is also incidentally the one that in which his sword in the scabbard is orientated to as an axis. So this basically, from a visual point of view, it counterbalances the horizontal lines of the horse and also the vertical one of the Condottieri. So he is actually pushing in this for it looks as if he was pushing in front. He was heading toward somewhere. It was moving on. And looking more in detail at the face of Gattamelata, first of all, you realize he's not wearing a helmet. At this point, all the Condottieri in battle wore one. The idea of taking your helm off was kind of a way to show off, but it was highly ideal, and naturally here, this was a portrait of Gattamanata, so he was without a helmet. And what is interesting here of this very martial figure is that his face is not actually has nothing of a warrior, of a war machine, but he is, on the contrary, governed by a sort of superior will, that knows basically how to win because he has thought for a very long time. So he knows it all. He's not anxious. He's concentrated because he knows he takes, control of the situation, but he already knows how it's gonna go. And if he maintains control as a human being, as a leader, as a military commander, he's gonna obtain victory. That's the important thing. And his actually the faces of Gattamanata is representing him when he was already old. Actually, in his very last time before his death, when he was ill. And so it actually looks like him, actually, and he has a very kind of characteristic face. So it's not being inspired to ideal models, it's meant to represent really the person as he was. And naturally, however, this is still inspired, the face is still inspired to the Roman portraits, the ancient Roman portraits, and there's a kind of realism that, however, is very equilibrated, physiognomically speaking, and also looking at the psychology of the ideal psychology of this person. So, and the most probably important part of the study is the look, the gaze, this fixed and proud look that highlights the determination, power, the strength of will, the attitude to command, military concentration, loyalty. In other words, also the moral integrity, because this was the point at the time, the great debate, whether these Condottieri were kind of faithful, reliable, and so on. So now the Republic of Venice wanted basically to remember his moral virtues also as a politically loyal person to the Republic. So this is important because from antiquity and even during the Middle Ages, actually the greatest warrior ideal had been the one of Alexander the Great, who was young and usually represented in this in his feud. So aside from he was beautiful because being strong and young and vigorous and so on. Here instead you have something different, more like Philip II, Alexander's father, that is the representation of a rational man. So a modern hero now. So not something that was going beyond, and that reflects in this sense also all the political and military developments that were happening at the time, at the thresholds of the modern age. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And the technique to which this was realized was, by the way, completely new. It seems was this was an ancient technique that was seemingly rediscovered by Donatello, basically creating a model in wax. Was worked in a particular fashion that there are several ways actually to achieve this. Whatever, it's not very important, but it's important because in general, because it's being rediscovered in this Renaissance times, and therefore used to represent things that were so similar to what was done in the past. Now this equestrian statue, and the monument of Gattamanata is basically the starting point of the revival of the equestrian monument in the West, that was alive pretty much up to the 19th century, at least. And it basically influenced the whole Renaissance in Italy and abroad. And there are many replicas of this as well, all over the world, telling you the truth, in Montevideo, in Moscow. So it's really a work that marked an era in many ways, and that represents really the symbol of the Condottieri as such, and with them also much more, definitely. The Verrocchio made also other. Excuse me, I search a little bit here if I can find, but I would pass to Leonardo actually, because this is being so long now. Oh well, but this is probably important, is the equestrian monument to also Bartolomeo Colleoni that we necessarily have to talk about. Excuse me, I'm marking here. This is very important and can't be ignored. So this is another equestrian, as you see, beautiful thing, that equestrian statue that was realized by Andrea del Verrocchio actually later, between 1480 and 1488, and this is instead placed in Venice itself, in the place in Campo San Zanipolo. And this is the second equestrian statue of the Renaissance after the one of Donatello, of Gattamelata. This is important because here you have really the Republic of Venice openly in 1479 decreeing the realization of this equestrian monument for Bartolomeo Colleoni that had died 4 years before. And in this area of the Campo Santi Giovanni and Paolo, basically, that so even a kind of a it's one of the widest areas in Venice. And the Venetian government entrusted this to the Verrocchio, and he basically started to work at this at Florence in his own shop. And in 1481, he sent the wax model to Venice, and in 1486, the artist went to live in Venice to participate to the casting of the bronze. And eventually, the Verrocchio died in 1488 when the statue was not completed. Even though he had surely several models of it, so he saw it, at least, that's how they were realized initially. And he, in his own testament, Verrocchio entrusted the execution of this work, and also as heir, I believe, of the work to Lorenzo di Credi, but the Venetian signory at this point preferred another local artist, Leopardi, who this has to be explained in part not just for internal convenience, but for the fact that Di Credi was essentially a painter, and so actually this person was tied to Verrocchio, but that were in the same shop several different craftsmen also who crafted different arts at that time. So these were also multi-specialists objectively, and they could have done, but it was preferred someone who was essentially a sculptor by profession. And now there are certain quotes, but looking at, because the video is excruciatingly long, let's skip certain things. Looking at the realization, also in here there was the Verrocchio was looking at the equestrian statue of Gattamelata. It was this first and unique precedent in recent times, and all the other statues that also had inspired, and also the drawings that we mentioned before, and so on. The most important thing of this work is that also in here was very always a problem to represent the horse standing on this narrow feet and with a paw raised. Sorry, not paw. So this was a very big problem because the bronze was extremely heavy. So there had to be other ways to fix the hooves of the horse, and the Donatello in Padua had solved the problem in a kind of a wise way. That was kind of safer, with putting that globe under the hoof of the rise and hoof of the horse. Verrocchio now instead achieved something more. He obtained, basically, he managed to make the monument standing on only 3 paws. This is very interesting. And there were the other, the one who surpassed this was eventually the equestrian monument of Philip IV of Spain, that is in Plaza de Oriente in Madrid, and that was achieved by Pietro Tacca. So this other, because the Italians maintained basically throughout all out the 18th century the artistical, greatest also technological advancement in some ways. That was realized, in fact, however, in much later than that, in the 17th century, in the mid 17th century, and Verrocchio added also some other artistical novelty to what Donatello had done, because Donatello had represented Gattamelata as we've seen. It is very kind of serene figure, very confident, so on. Verrocchio instead looked at, basically showed, you see it from the picture, this sort of dynamic rigidity of the Condottieri. He's looking with his chest, rising and energically rotated. The head looking straight at the enemy, and the legs that are well opened in this kind of strong and grandiose and physical way. So this is very important, because there is all an internal balance that is even difficult to explain now. But if you look at the lines, the orthogonal lines of this figure, you realize how the dynamic effect is kind of amplified. And also the armor of the Condottieri is different, because this is really kind of realistic. Donatello had realized this kind of light and ancient inspired armor. Now here in the Verrocchio you find the true heavy armor that was used on the battlefields at the time. So it's something very heavy, very strong, and so on. And also the saddle is kind of more concrete, even though Donatello had represented it already in a modern fashion. And it's interesting because there is also a game of light. Even the helm of Bartolomeo Colleoni, this Condottieri had has this very heavy face that makes him look, the helm just makes him look, his face even grimmer and kind of ferocious, and then that's it. And it's a very beautiful statue indeed. And just a word on Colleoni at this point, that we was this Condottieri that had he essentially served Venice and Milan at the same time, and he had become Captain General of the Serenissima as well. So we don't have time now. We're talking about art. Maybe we will discuss about this Condottieri on another occasion. Another figure I would like to conclude with the portraits is this one, at least the visual ones, is the one of, and I sign here, it's from Leonardo, and this is also very, very beautiful. And this is a naturally as you see, a drawing, a profile of of an ancient captain. This is the point, and this is this kind of drawing was realized by the so-called silver point technique that basically left this mark on paper with a specific paper, and this was realized by Leonardo da Vinci in seemingly the around 1475. This drawing is preserved now at the British Museum in London, and it's beautiful to watch. It's one of my favorite actually, and it looks here a very grim looking and upright captain in a profile, looking from the left, and wearing this extremely pompous armor that is obviously inspired to ancient models. Naturally, it's very fantastic in imaginative in the essentials, but it's still following certain realistic criteria. And you see, for instance, it's kind of weird things, like for instance the dragon wings that depart from the temple, from the how you say that, from the sign of the hand, from the temples, yes, and there are many other kind of natural elements, kind of phytomorphic ornamentations. There's even a lion head you can see from the chest. This was definitely inspired to those phalerae of the ancient Romans, and this is all these flying and the elements, and this is kind of typical of the young Leonardo. And if you look at the grim face, especially of the Condottieri, you see this extremely serious and expressive face that adds up to the war. What I find interesting in a video that theoretically was dominated by the military background now is to look at these works not really just as ideal representations, but really as a product of a society that wanted to that was deeply impressed by the might of these fighters and wanted to emulate them, to express their realism. So looking at its face, just imagine how a commander can look on the field, extremely serious, extremely concentrated, and it's a beautiful portrait indeed. And initially it was believed that this came from the workshop of the Verrocchio. And because the Verrocchio realized a series of works that he sculpted for Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, that are actually objectively similar. And in fact, a similar armor also is found in the bust of Julian de Medici. That was a terracotta, is also attributed to the Verrocchio, and so on. And these were kind of realized in the same years, between 1475 and 1478. So surely Leonardo knew something about these things and probably got inspired by them. But nevertheless, it's a masterpiece of fusion of fantastic but also classical and ultimately realistic elements as well in this frame. So I don't know now what we can talk about. Well, let's leave it with this on the background, because I believe it's still nice. And let's look at something else now that is, I know the video is very long and I could do it in another time, but it's still important because now we have mostly looked at the plastic and figurative arts, but these weren't the only ones that the Condottieri basically put in motion. There were also poets and writers that really had a lot to do because of this, to exalt and to maybe on their own or on commission the Condottieri. Naturally, these were as we've seen, propagandistic works. So they essentially these people were interested in them. There was money to make with these works, and these people were, maybe they hated the Condottieri, but at the same time they gave them money also as patrons, and therefore they realized this works for them. And talking about this, I would discuss Petrarca, in fact. Petrarca is, as you know, after Dante, the greatest, arguably I think the greatest poet of the Middle Ages. There is his work is really varied now. He wrote both in Latin and vernacular, but we'll concentrate mostly on his political views now for a while, just briefly, because he was essentially he was living in this essentially the full 14th century, and this was a moment of great unrest, because it was the moment of essentially of great crisis, of the Black Death, of the collapse of the universalistic powers, the war of the 100 Years' War, and the soldiers of fortune into Italy that were making a freaking mess at that point. And Petrarch was a kind of a proto-national poet for Italian standards, because he was basically stressing the idea that Italy at this point had the prerogative, that they had that was being attacked by foreigners, because now the soldiers of fortune were mostly German or from other nationalities, and he asked the Italians basically to revive in a certain way. Indeed, from the end of the 14th century, the soldiers of fortune in Italy start to be almost completely Italian once again, and that's also why in the 15th century there is this formalization of Italian lords that made a living as condottieri as well, because they had taken over. The phase of the soldiers of foreign soldiers of fortune kind of ended for some reason, also because these Italian political entities began to strengthen and to basically to expel them, or at least to maybe hire them, but in this sense framing them into their power. The 14th century, a very dramatic age, and Petrarch was actually he was a great traveler. He worked in Avignon. He went as a diplomat, as an ambassador in Bohemia. He was in Rome. He loved the classics. He's considered essentially the first humanist, and he knew many languages, and he knew many people. He had many different. Petrarch had a beautiful life for the standards. I identify quite much with him for theoretical, ambitions and interests and character and personality. I think, and he had this set of friends, of patrons, if you want to call them, that essentially were patronizing them, patronizing him as a poet, as an artist, and some of these were in practice military men, indeed. So they were. He praised them in his works as well, and these were kind of early condottieri in some way. One was definitely Stefano Colonna the Elder. He lived between 1265 and 1348, so he was Petrarch was still relatively young when he knew him. This guy was Stefano was the son of Giovanni Colonna, one of the most important figures in Rome in the first half of the 14th century. The Colonna family were heirs to the papal fief of Palestrina, and in 1290 Stefano was named Count of Romagna. And he was several times senator of Rome and imperial vicar into Italy. So he was a staunch Ghibelline. And this is interesting, we also in here, now it's very complicated to discuss, but Petrarch had kind of mixed feelings for the papacy and the empire. I mean, he were maybe a bit also hypocritical in some ways. But however, the most important thing is now the political siding is that Stefano Colonna fought extensively against the famously Guelph Orsini family that were the main Roman family opposed to the Colonna. And Stephen was protector of Petrarch, and and Petrarch dedicated certain sonnets and other works to him. And interestingly enough, Stephen was also adverse to Cola di Rienzo, that instead was kind of friend with Petrarch. Petrarch knew him when Cola di Rienzo was in prison in Prague, under the Luxembourgs, and he was actually, as a prisoner, teaching the local scholars, the classic, the humanist tradition. And Petrarch went there in an embassy, and he basically made friends with him, and he was kind of fascinated also by his own projects of Roman restoration on a classical basis, because Petrarch was a great advocate for the recovery of the classical legacy of Rome and so on. Also, he famously, Stefano was brother to Sciarra Colonna, the one who slapped the Pope Boniface the allegedly slapped Boniface VIII. Was so fiercely against him, and also enemy of friend with Philip IV of France against the Pope. That I made a video about that. If you're interested, I can tell you in the playlist where it is. It's medieval Christianity, of course, but also in medieval France. This is conflict between Philip IV and Boniface VIII, plain and simple. The another person that was praised by Petrarch was Orso dell'Anguillara. So this was another interesting figure. Always kind of this Roman milieu, we can say. He Orso dell'Anguillara was born in Rome, also here in the first 14th century, and he was a son of the Anguillara and family, and the Orsini partly, and he became a kind of he was a clergyman actually, and but this didn't stop him actually from expanding territorially in this clamorous personal of self-interest and so on. And he actually fought eventually against the same patrimony of the church at that point. And this was a kind of a major check for Pope John the 22nd, who had kind of bet on him and his brothers. And so these were the Roman aristocracy had an incredibly markedly military nature at this time, also because the situation in there was a mess. So it was continuous warfare, continuous instability. These Roman families were really all about war. And eventually, and he was involved in essentially into this wars in this ever-going wars, basically. That entailed naturally also these Condottieri companies that were rising incredibly, and he was Petrarch was hosted by Orso and his wife Agnese in the castle of Capranica, and he defined him as actually as a very strenuous fighter, and but also inclined towards peace. This was the usual propaganda and hypocrisy, if you want, of the time. And he made friends with him as well. And seemingly, what is very interesting about this is that you might imagine this military man to be kind of rough and ignorant, but on the contrary, some of them were extremely cultured, as we've seen, especially in this context. But with the great lords of the 15th century, it's kind of normal. They had courts and so on, but these were kind of more like knights and fire. And yet he was also in this case was a man of great culture, and he was seemingly also a poet in some ways. He was senator of Rome at some point together with the Orsini. So you see, Petrarch was actually frequenting both Colonna and the Orsini in some measure. And well, however, this was just worth of a brief mention. And also to Pandolfo Malatesta, that there was part of the same Malatesta family that we mentioned, Sigismund Pandolfo, before. He was this military family had always been about war. In fact, in 1356, Pandolfo had been hired by the Visconti, and at this point he was already friend with Petrarch, by whom had also had a portrait made. Petrarch also kind of made a drawing, and Petrarch dedicated a sonnet to him of the from his canzoniere to actually celebrate Pandolfo's juvenile military endeavors. And however, at one point, Pandolfo kind of fell into disgrace among Bernabo, the Visconti household, and he escaped Milan and went to Prague. And at this point, at this point, Petrarch kind of turned his back to him because he wanted, to remain friend with Visconti. So he wrote actually 2 letters, deploring the former Visconti commander to the king of Naples, Louis of Taranto, and to the Este as well. And however, the Petrarch and Pandolfo kind of came back to meet each other, to talk, when Petrarch abandoned Milan for going to live in Padua. And at this point they met, and they met also in Pavia after that. Pandolfo was reconciled with the Visconti eventually. And in 1371, Pandolfo invited his friend to Pesaro, of whom he had become lord in 1364. Remember Pesaro we mentioned before, when his father had died, to escape the plague at that point. But Petrarch was very old at that time. He would die 3 years later. He was already in this kind of retirement in this place called Arquà, that is close there in the Veneto region, and Petrarch, however, was writing basically that the part of a re-elaborate form of certain letters, and here a re-elaborate form of his canzoniere was destined to go to to be destined to Malatesta, basically. And also Pandolfo died actually a short while afterwards, and Petrarch, so they kind of died more or less in the same period. And these were important to remember. But there were other artists that had relation with these, with the world of the Condottieri in many ways. Very important is for Milan, Cicco Simonetta, who wrote this biography of Francesco Sforza. Here we are in the full 15th century instead. Simonetta was this political figure. He lived between 1410 and 1480. He was Chancellor of Francesco Sforza in 1444, and he distinguished himself also in the War of Lombardy, where he was then governor of Lodi and then of Sartirana, and he was a consular and secretary of the Dukes Francesco and Galeazzo of Milan, and he was actually a great man. He was a very clever man who helped them in their government. When Galeazzo was assassinated, Simonetta saved kind of the Sforza dynasty, because he managed to preserve the dynasty for the minor Gian Galeazzo, and in turn, however, he became temporarily the true master of the Milanese state, when eventually the Duchess Bona of Savoia was basically provoked the kind of revolt that brought to the to the strengthening the side of so-called Ludovico il Moro. And at this point, Simonetta was captured and beheaded with a very brief process. And there is a very vast amount of works that's being left for him. And so this is the case, and also several, and this biography of Francesco, so that he was celebrating as also as a military commander, the Milanese. The Sforza had risen, in fact, for Francesco was a Condottieri himself, and that's how he had risen to power. But there are others. For instance, there is the work of Antonio Campano, who also he was a humanist and a bishop, actually, and he was a protege of Cardinal Bessarione, famously, making part of the court of Pius II that we also mentioned before. He wrote a funerary oration for him, and he was famous mostly for these orations, poems, and other letters in Latin. He was an extremely cultured person that in this Roman circle, and he taught also in the Florentine Academy. He was known for his Latin poetry mostly, and he wrote this life of the Condottiere Braccio da Montone, who was also one of the greatest of his time. He also kind of founded a proper school of fighting, a tactical school, so if it's maybe a big word, because it was mostly a philosophy that was developed observing him. The Sforza and the da Montone, in the way they had usually been fighting. So these are names worth just to mention in practice. And in these models, however, what you realize in this humanistic environment now is that there is Plutarch's portrait of the Condottiere that is basically the hero, the exemplar hero. And all this stems from this propaganda, basically literary propaganda that was born partly because of the type of society that naturally was out there. And so the aim was to basically justifying this aura of glory that was actually pretty undeserved sometimes, given that glory is quite empty sometimes. But this is the idea that the myth we still have today of the Condottieri basically lives through these works. Interestingly enough, and we mostly know the Condottieri through this, as people, as men, because objectively we don't know a freaking much about them in the first place, and it's already this artistical production that was produced around them that eventually brought them to fame and built this legacy of might and power that objectively these Italian commanders contributed themselves to build in ideological terms. And this is fundamental, because you realize that here the Condottiero is also a statesman. He's a patron of the arts. He's a collectionist. And if you look at the splendid ducal palace in Urbino, you can fantastically understand what it means. And not surprisingly, it's in here that the Italian poet and writer Baldassare Castiglione chooses his setting for his own cortegiano, the courtesan, who was basically to become the courtly etiquette of early medieval Europe all over the European courts that had been produced in this Urbino setting, dominated by the Montefeltro dynasty that we have seen before with Federico, and that was considered one of the practically most refined court in Europe at that point, and was a court that was based on definitely the political and military power, but it was also aggrandizing itself through this propaganda. It was based instead on art, on literature, on knowledge, on these beautiful, even visual masterpieces that were intended to celebrate the glory of the dynasty and of these figures that were so important. So this is a very long video today, but at least I tried to cover as much as possible, and I think it's interesting because it shows basically at how so many levels you have this representation of the Condottieri, and how also the artists were tied to these patrons that were masters of war, but also masters of the of elegances, if you want. And we're kind of combining the two things, and without that system, without that political mirror system, objectively, we wouldn't have this thing, because in other words, this was quite different. There were great courts at this time, but not all of them had reached this level of refinement as the ones of the Italian lordships that sometimes were ruled by these condottieri as well. In the future I will keep discussing about this, also about maybe from a strictly ideological point of view. I mean, looking at how even the hypocrisy that I just mentioned, that obviously was out there, and it's proper of every propaganda. Every propaganda is hypocritical by definition, I would say. And the idea is to look at this world really also beyond what we can. Of course, we are in awe and amazed by seeing, you know, what this great works of art and so on. But at the same time, we have to see that there is a world behind this that has a greater depth, that also stemmed from war, from blood. And the money that were made through this war, to this blood, were used also to create essentially the Renaissance, and therefore modern Europe as we know it. Sorry. And yeah, I would like to leave you just with this, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.